Good evening, and welcome to the International Affairs Forum. My name is Brian Bishop, and it's an honor for me to host tonight's event. We've got a special piece going tonight. If everyone looks back at this camera in the back left-hand corner here, wave. We have about 50 to 100 students back over in Scholars Hall that are going to be watching this from a simulcast, and Admiral Titley was kind enough to go over there and say hi to them earlier, just a little bit ago. I'd like to remind everybody, next month, we're going to do kind of a 2-for-1. On the 10th of November, we are teaming up with the State Theater to bring free to the community a documentary called Disturbing the Peace. And then we will have a post-film discussion with our own Jack Siegel. Disturbing the Peace is a new film about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that won the first ever Robert Ebert Humanitarian Award in April. It's a transformative documentary about former elite Israeli and Palestinian soldiers who unite under a common banner to protest the bloodshed that has traumatized both of their countries. And then the next week, following that, on November 17th, we will have the opportunity to discuss that with Steve Simon, who is the White House Director of the Middle East Affairs during the Obama administration. So you'll definitely want to put those two dates on your calendar. Again, 10 November for the film, and 17 November for Steve Simon. Tonight, I want to thank a couple people. First, the NMC Office of Media and Technologies and Film. Thank you all very much up there for all your technical support. Thank you to NMC for our ability to use the Millikan Auditorium here. I also want to thank Dr. Lisa Del Buono from the Citizens of Climate Change. She was very instrumental in helping us get Dr. Titley here to speak. And lastly, but not leastly, all of our IAF members and our patron members, thank you. Without your participation and your membership, we would not be able to make these events happen, so thank you very, very much. So Dr. David Titley is a professor of practice in meteorology and a professor of international affairs at Penn State University. He's also the founding director of Penn State's Center for Solutions to Weather and Climate Risk. He has served as a naval officer for 32 years and rose to the rank of Rear Admiral. And in that capacity, he had duties as the Naval Meteorological and Oceanography Command, oceanographer and navigator of the Navy, Deputy Assistant Chief of Naval Operations for Information Dominance. He also served as a Senior Military Assistant for the Director, Office of Net Assessment in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. While serving in the Pentagon, Dr. Titley initiated and led the U.S. Navy's Task Force on Climate Change. After retiring from the Navy, he served as the Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for Operations, the Chief Operating Officer position at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Dr. Titley serves on numerous advisory boards and scientific boards and is a fellow of the American Meteorological Society and was awarded an honorary PhD from the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Rear Admiral retired Dr. David Titley.
Well, thanks so much, everyone. You guys can hear me? Yes? Okay, great. So I really want to thank, first I want to thank General Bishop for a very, very kind introduction and really for hosting me today. So that's really above and beyond the call if you had to put up with me for the whole day. And International Affairs Council, thank you so much. And yes, tomorrow, it'll be with Citizens Climate Lobby in Central Michigan. So yes, I'm from Penn State. You know who we play this Saturday? It's that school down south, right? So my guess is for at least 48 hours, you guys will be Penn State fans. You know, after Saturday night, probably don't care so much. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about climate change, maybe in a slightly different way than what you might have heard it before. And you can kind of tell from the title, People Not Polar Bears. If you were looking for the Greenpeace lecture, you might be in the wrong place, because I'm not going to do that one tonight. Just kind of what we'll cover here. I'll just do a few basics so that people can kind of see where I'm coming from. And then we'll talk about this as a security risk, how we're going to tackle this, and some things we can do and are doing. And then a little bit, just one or two slides on energy, and then we'll just wrap it up there. So first, I'll just give you a tiny little background about me. Any idea what this thing is here? It's a rain gauge. And the reason I have that here is when I was 9 years old, that was my pride and joy. So I was one of these kids who kind of knew from the time I was about yay high, I was going to do something with weather. And this is right after you want to be a policeman and a fireman and a snowplow driver and all that kind of stuff, you know. And my parents are like, yeah, sure, you're going to do this. You'll change your mind in 2 weeks. They're still waiting for me to change my mind. So this was really, I was going to do weather. I didn't know about the Navy. I didn't know about, let alone climate or anything. But I've just always been interested in weather. So I grew up in upstate New York. And the nearest big place where you do weather is Penn State. So I went there actually as an undergrad way back when, you know, to do sort of the stuff on the lower left. And although that's not me, that could have been me back on the lower right there because everything was hand plotted and hand analyzed back in the day. And my parents said, that's great. You're going to Penn State. You got yourself accepted. Oh, by the way, we don't really have money to send you there, so you might want to figure out how you're going to do this. So I kind of said, okay. Looked around, and there was something called Reserve Officer Training Corps, which is a pretty good deal, actually, for those of you if you haven't heard about it. They'll give you a scholarship, take care of tuition and stuff like that, and in return, you owe them 4 days. So as much as I would love to tell you that the reason I ended up in the Navy is because my great-great-great-grandfather was John Paul Jones, none of that's true. I needed the money. And it was a 4-year commitment, but I was a great guy, so I was on what I called the 4-year-in-a-day program. I was going to give him 1 extra day. But a funny thing happened. It turns out that I enjoyed being at sea. I enjoyed being a naval officer. And so 4 years in a day turned into, well, as long as it's still fun and the Navy thinks I'm minimally competent and doesn't throw me out. And that ended up being about 32 years. So that's how I ended up in the Navy. It wasn't a grand plan. It just sort of worked out that way. After I retired from the Navy, I went to work for NOAA as their chief operating officer. And I did that for a little while, for just under a year or so, and then realized it's really time to go and do something other than the federal government. So now, as mentioned, I'm back at Penn State and teaching there and having a great time. So that's kind of me. I tell people that really I'm a recovering weather forecaster and just sort of stumbled into this climate type thing, but I'm a weather guy. I mean, that's really what I am. So just really a little bit about Penn State. We're pretty good program, and one of the things that's kind of cool, and I'll just mention this part, is we've got a lot of people who do climate and a lot of people who do weather. And I think one of the most interesting places from the science perspective is how do these things meet? In a lot of programs, they sort of do one or the other, but they don't do both. And sort of understanding how do you get from sort of forecasting into weather is actually pretty interesting, because if you're a business, this isn't defense per se, although it's true in defense as well, but if you're a business, if you're running a city, Traverse City or any city, you may not care that much about the year 2100 or 2150, but you sure care what's going to happen in the next 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, 40 years for your infrastructure, for planning. When am I going to have really cold times, really warm times? When should I put extra money in my snow budget? When can I take it out and do other things? So if weather, writ large, can get better at helping both private sector and government make those kinds of decisions, then we're being useful. And that's some of the stuff we're working on in my day job. Okay, we're going to talk about climate, and trust me, we'll talk plenty about climate. But what I like to do, just at least briefly, is try to remind people that it certainly is not the only big issue that we are all collectively going to confront and deal with in the 21st century. We are going to really deal with food, water, and energy. It's really hard to have life, certainly life as we like to live it, without those three components, and there is an increasing competition for those. We are, whether we like it or not, whether we think it's good or not, the reality is, at least today, we live in a globalized society. So if you have floods in Thailand that are pretty bad, that can actually knock out the disk supply chain for high-tech companies like Apple, and we got to within a few days of running out of parts and pieces to put our iPhones and our Macs together a few years ago. So climate impacts, even if they're literally halfway around the world, because we're globalized and we're all kind of tied together, can impact us. Technology keeps marching on. That is not my phone on the left. Some people wondered if it was. Not anymore, not as of last year at least. So, but one of the things that it does a lot of things, of course. We could talk all night about just technology. But one of the things it does is it actually drives transparency. Again, whether we like it or not, we know a whole lot more. I mean, just look at the whole National Security Agency leaks. Look at WikiLeaks. So we're all electronic, and a lot more of that stuff, maybe than we would like to, sometimes gets out. Why does that matter from this? It means that however we deal with big problems, whether we want it to or not, everybody's going to know. So you might as well just assume that everyone's going to know and make sure everybody's part of that conversation because of technology. They're going to be there at some point anyways. You know, kind of one of the big parts is, oh, by the way, we're doing this now in a population of over 7 billion, going to 8, 9 billion people. So even if you put all that climate stuff aside, for example, we need more calories, more food calories for the world in the next 60 years than we've grown in the last 500. That's from the US Department of Agriculture. So that alone is a pretty significant challenge. And again, now we're going to do this in this changing environment, in this changing climate. But, you know, if we need to either move people, migrate, whatever, that's a lot of people. So that's another big driver. And then, you know, I've got this picture of G20 finance ministers, and what in goodness name are they doing in a climate brief? Did I, like, copy and paste the wrong thing? No, because our self-talk in much of the West, in this country and much of the West, is that we're out of money. Again, is that true? Is it not? I'm not going to say, but we tell ourselves that. So we still have, you know, these what's called the Budget Control Act, sequestration. You may have heard of that. That stuff hasn't been repealed. You know, that's going to actually come back if the Congress doesn't and the administration doesn't figure out another deal. And a lot of that's happening in Europe as well. So we've got population, climate, globalization, competition for resources, ever-increasing technology, and we say we're broke. These are the challenges. Now, I'm not going to talk a ton more about the non-climate issues, but whenever I talk climate, I think it's useful to sort of remember it's not happening in isolation. It both is affected and it impacts all these other big issues. Okay, so I'm going to talk really why do we care about climate? And just a really quick show of hands, who read cover to cover the latest IPCC report? It's only about like yay thick, I think, if you lay them all, print them out and lay them end to end. You know, okay, I didn't either. So easier question. 3 years ago, the US government put out what they called a National Climate Assessment. And that was a svelte 1,050 pages. Anybody read that one end to end? Yeah, I didn't either. So what I found is, when I worked in the Pentagon, is you learned that both, this really goes across all services, admirals and generals, usually they're at least about average intelligence, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but let's say they're average intelligence. But collectively, and I think General Bishop might agree with this, is we have the attention span of a gnat. So unless you can put it like on one slide or one piece of paper with big font, then you might lose the thing. So I try to do that for climate, and I'll just, you know, and if you guys can remember, like when we walk out of here, these 3 words, I'm actually pretty happy. It's people, it's water, it's change. That's fundamentally how I view the climate change issue or risk. And when I say that, I'm talking about people It's not about polar bears or even polar bear plunges. This might be Traverse City for all I know. This is really because it's going to affect you and me. It's going to affect our families, our sons, our daughters, our grandchildren, our neighbors, our fellow town, everybody who lives in our town, everybody who lives in our region, our state, and our country. This is fundamentally why I deal with this, is because it's about people. It's going to affect all of us. It's about the water. You could argue that there's probably some other integrating principles, but if you think about it, one of the things that climate changes, and it changes it because we're changing the heat balance on the Earth, is it changes a fundamental distribution and redistribution of water. So you end up with too much or too little. It falls at the wrong place at wrong time. It's dry where it used to be wet, wet where it used to be dry. It's salty where it used to be fresh, liquid where it used to be solid. And even the chemistry of the oceans themselves are changing, and it's changing faster than some of the ecosystems can deal with. So that water is really this what I would call this integrating principle, and kind of where the rubber meets the road, if you will, one of the real impacts of that. It also turns out that it's really hard to get food without water. We all kind of know that. It's really hard to get energy without water. With a few exceptions, such as photovoltaic, solar, and wind, almost all of our energy requires a whole, I guess a technical term would be ton, of water. And whether it's coal, whether it's natural gas, whether it's nuclear, oil, they all require a lot of water, either in the production or in the generation and maintenance of that power. And then finally, this is sort of the one thing, not a ton scares me, but this kind of scares me on the climate. It's not the climate that scares me, it's the climate change. I mean, we're in Traverse City. You're about to go into fall, like we are in Pennsylvania, of course. So in State College, I mean, we get the winds off Lake Erie. Basically, when I say goodbye to the sun here in a week or two, when we get into November, I'll probably see it again in March. Nobody's claiming that's an ideal climate. Anybody live in San Diego, used to live in San Diego? Somebody's got to. Okay, sir, yeah, you guys have ideal climate. Everybody else, not so much. But what we have known, though, it's been more or less within bounds. Obviously, each year is different, but within bounds, it's been a stable and knowable and predictable climate. We knew more or less, if anybody here farms, cherries, wine, we know pretty much when the last freeze is. We know when the first freeze is. We know about how much rain falls in the summer. We know about how cold it's going to be in the winter and which bugs that kills off and which ones it doesn't. And you could say that sort of for everyone. We've had this stability. We've had stability for the last 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years in sea levels. So if we built a city on the coast, it was on the coast. It wasn't 20 feet above or 20 feet below. It was on the coast. Now, we're kind of getting on this escalator, at least for temperature. That's actually in the Washington metro system. I found a day where it was actually working. It was nice. And anybody been to Washington, you'd understand that. And we're getting on that escalator. We're already on the lower parts, and we're going up. So we no longer have that stability. And we've kind of literally built human civilization. We never thought about it per se, but we've actually built civilization on that implied premise of climate stability. And now that's going away. But we're going to deal with it now, not just a few million people sort of hunter-gatherers. We're going to deal with it with 8 billion people in the Treaty of Westphalia and all that. So if we do this right, it'll be a bumpy road. It'll be a real bumpy road. If we do it wrong, then we get some real nasty security issues. So people, water, change. That's kind of what this is fundamentally about. Any idea what this is? Sextant. Yeah, I know. Looking out here, at least probably half the audience realizes there was a time in the world when you navigated and you didn't just pull this thing out and it told you to within 2 meters of where you were in the world. So one of my first jobs in the Navy, and I would argue maybe my best job, is I got to be navigator on an old guided missile destroyer. And what you learn pretty quickly is look at all the data, look at all the information, but don't trust any one piece of it 100%. use that stuff God gave you in between your ears and try to integrate it and evaluate it. And then you come up with, okay, I'm here, and you get a feel for, yeah, I know I'm here, or it's like, I don't know how well I am. But when I was asked by the head of the Navy in 2009 to look at climate, this is kind of what I did. I said, okay, I was a weather guy. I really hadn't looked at climate very much. You know, you hear this stuff, some of it makes you kind of raise your eyebrows. Geez, is that a little alarmist? Is it whatever? So I said, okay, let's just look. So I went through, and I don't have time tonight to go through all the data, but I mean, I literally started with talking to astrophysicists and heliophysicists, people who study the sun, people like Margaret Linen, and I said, hey, Margaret, is the sun getting hotter or getting colder? What do we know? And it turns out that it's basically stayed the same. If anything, it's a tiny, tiny bit colder, but it's basically stayed the same. So you say, well, okay, that's not why things are warming up. And then you start looking, how much is it warming up? And I looked at things like ocean temperatures, atmosphere temperatures. Are glaciers receding or are they advancing? Turns out over 90% are going backwards. They're receding. You look at the ecosystems, because the birds aren't like watching MSNBC or Fox News. You know, they're just doing what they do. And you start seeing that the migrations are getting earlier, and you see that the leaves are coming out a little bit earlier, or the birds and the critters are going up to higher elevations. So lots of what we would call independent data. You know, if you don't believe one thing, that's okay, but, you know, or you're not convinced that that one piece of evidence may be all that great, but you sort of integrate all these very, very different pieces of evidence, and you start getting a picture. So again, I'm not going to go through all of that tonight. I'm just going to run a couple of short videos. This is from my friends at NASA, and let me just set this up for you. So basically, what you're going to see in the lower center of the screen, I hope you can see that. It says 1884 right now. It's going to go through, imagine taking all the thermometers on the Earth, average them up for a year, and then compare that number to the long-term 20th century average for that point on the Earth. And if it's right at the average, it's white. If it's colder, it's blue. If it's warmer, it's oranges, yellows, and reds there. And then we just put this into a loop, and we just kind of see it. So you'll see sort of the splotchy changes, but it really shows you, you know, what's going on. So let me see if I can run this for you here. Okay, here we go. So 1890, 1900, come up through World War I. You can kind of see how Europe did in World War I, 1914, 18. You know, we get warm. Watch the Dust Bowl. Here's 30. Watch the US, 36. So it got pretty warm in the US, but there was lots of areas that it wasn't terribly warm. 50s. Here's the 60s. If you can remember them, what is it? You weren't there, right? 70s. 80s. Oh, we're not done yet. 90s. Y2K, we made it. And this loop goes to 2012. And if I had 2014, 15, 16, we've actually now set hottest ever records the last couple of years. I'll run it just one more time because I think it's kind of neat, and you can either watch, here in Michigan, you can watch maybe, you know, maybe your parents came from Europe or your grandparents came from Asia. You can kind of see how it was like in other parts of the world or Africa. And you can just kind of see that this is how, you know, it kind of shows that year average, and there's certainly variability. And I got a lot of, you know, things even this morning, you know, from people says, hey, climate's always changed. And you're right, it has always changed. But that doesn't exclude the fact that, man, we can change it as well. The two are not mutually exclusive. So we still have these ups and downs, natural variability, but they kind of stay in a channel. And now we're adding, as I think you can see, you know, kind of a forcing function, if you will, and it's coming up. So that's just air temperature. And I'll show you again. We could spend all night, we could spend all week on this stuff. But let me go to a different graph here. So this doesn't come from NASA. This comes from my friends at NOAA. And it'll run for a little bit. I'll just try to orient you. Imagine like you've got this super bird's eye view from several thousand miles up, and you're looking right down on the North Pole. So Greenland is at the 4 o'clock position, Canada's at 6 o'clock, Alaska is like 7 or 8 o'clock there. Russia goes from about 9 o'clock to midnight. It's really big. And then Scandinavia over at the 1 or 2 o'clock. So that's the orientation. And we're looking at the Arctic Ocean, and we're actually looking at sea ice. And it's kind of cool. All we've done, again, this is not, just like the last one I should have mentioned, that was not a model, it's not a projection, it's just what's happened. Same thing with this, not a model, not a computer, thinking maybe someday. This is just measuring, and we actually use, it's called microwave satellites. The cool thing is they can look through the dark, because there's a lot of dark, and they can look through the clouds, there's a lot of clouds. The even cooler thing than that is you actually get a different signal if it's really old, hard, thick ice compared to the ice that's relatively thin and it's maybe only formed a year or two ago. So my friends at NOAA, they colored up the new ice as blue and the really old ice is white, and this is what you see. Now watch, and the time is running down at the bottom. So 2006, watch what happens in 07. Boom, it almost goes away. Tries to come back in 08 and 09 like my stock market portfolio did. And then in 12, it goes down even more. And if I had the current dates, it went up a little from 12, and then in just this past year, we were not quite, but almost back down to where we were in 2012. So again, different years, some more, some less, but I hope you can see the overall trend. What I can tell you is if you had told 90% of the people who studied this, let's say in the year 2000, that by the year 2012, we would have basically lost all that old, hard, thick ice, the stuff that's white, they would have said, you're crazy. They said, yeah, maybe by the middle of the century, by the end of the century. It's happened by 2012. So whether we know it or not, or we pay attention or not, the Arctic has fundamentally changed in the last 15 or 20 years, fundamentally changed. That's happened. So when people say, this stuff's going to be sometime in the future, it's already happened. And there's a bunch of security issues, and we'll talk about them. So again, I could talk way more about all this, but now I'll just show you a couple of the models, because I had, today I had some people saying, the models, we don't really believe them. It was like computer models, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. We know they're not very good, right? So I'll show you a couple. The one on the top left, if it looks like it's a PDF of a Xerox of a PDF of a Xerox, it's because it is. Comes out of a science magazine that was published back in 1980, and a guy named Jim Hansen, this is a science guy, not the Muppets guy, he basically ran those black lines are his model. And again, he probably ran them on a computer that has less computing power than this thing here. But he ran that, and the good thing is he published it. So we can all look it up. You can go to the library, find it. And now the really cool thing is you can say, well, was he right or not? And that's what the purple line is. So technically, he actually was wrong. Why? He was colder. He was too conservative. He didn't get enough warming. But I would say it was useful because he said, hey, we're going to start getting on that escalator, and sure enough, we have. The one on the right, these are the much more sophisticated models you sometimes hear about in the news, the so-called IPCC models that some people said, they're no good. Well, in I think I go up to 2014 on this one, we're right on the black line. We're right in the middle of where we kind of should be there. And actually in 15 and 16, we're slightly over that black line. So again, some years up, some years down, but I hope you can see the trend. And that vertical line right here at 2000, that's when these models were run. So we knew all the stuff on the left. We didn't know the stuff on the right. And I would argue the computer models have done okay on that. So when you hear people like kind of poo-poo the models, they're actually not that bad. And it's not just the government models. My friends at then Esso, now Exxon, back in December 1980, they basically had the same answer that Jim Hansen did back then. Now, what they chose to do with it, that could be another discussion for another day, but they kind of saw back in 1980 that we're going to get on this escalator. So private sector, government, we all got the same answer. So what I tell people is, the science, we actually understand the basics. And this is kind of why. So I use this sometimes in the Pentagon. It was great. You know, and my fellow admirals would say, Titley, what the, well, I won't tell you exactly what they said. You know, have you got religion or something like that? And I said, no, I just go to the Church of the Radiative Transfer Equation, which is what this is. You know, and not only is it pretty basic physics, and it actually is pretty basic physics, but it's physics that we figured out in the 19th century. It was a bunch of old white guys that figured this stuff out. So you got Fourier, you got Tyndall, a Scot, so you had a Frenchman, a Scot, a Swede, Arnhus. They did not go into a bar. But by the time you get between 1842 and 1900, on the right-hand side, you know, we actually understood what greenhouse gases do, how they basically trap the heat. That was what Fourier figured out. And by the time you get to Arnhus, he actually figured out he was doing calculations with paper and pencil because of the Industrial Revolution. He actually underestimated the amount of greenhouse gases, but he had basically the right idea. So what I tell people is that the basics of climate science is this is cutting-edge 19th century science we're talking about here. I mean, that's what it is. Now, if we get time at the end, there's a ton of really interesting questions. But the basics we know really, really well. Okay, so here's audience participation time. I'm going to ask you guys, you know, who believes in climate change? And I don't mean just believe, I mean who believes in climate change? So show of hands if you believe in climate change. Okay, I do not. I know, that's a cheap rhetorical trick, isn't it? But let me tell you why I do not believe in climate change. I am convinced by the evidence that the climate is changing. But to me, this is science. This is not a belief system. A belief system is probably something you might do on a Friday night, a Saturday night, a Sunday morning. Those are belief systems. And we all have belief systems, and if I get to the end of my slide deck, I'll tell you a couple of my belief systems. But this is really, what does the evidence convince you? To me, there is so much overwhelming independent evidence, and we've understood the physics, the whys, for well over 100 years. That's why I am convinced by the evidence that the climate is changing. But to me, it's not a belief system. So when that crazy uncle comes to Thanksgiving here in a few weeks and said, I don't believe this stuff, well, tell him neither do you. You know, and see what you get. Okay, let's talk about a little bit of the security issues here. So this is a slide. I know it looks kind of boring, but I had to give it to 70 admirals from 70 different countries. So you want to keep it simple. Remember the attention span, what I told you. And also, if you look at this, the only place that it even says climate is up in the header. I don't even talk about it. So like if you're ever talking about climate, or really anything, you try to like talk in their language, not in yours. I mean, yes, I can talk science geek stuff and it's fun and all that sort of thing. That doesn't really help many people, honestly. But if I'm talking to senior military professionals of really almost any service, of any country, they understand like those column headings. They understand capacity. They understand readiness. Readiness means not only do I have soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines and equipment, but those men and women know how to use it. They're effective. We can maintain it, and we can use this in hostile conditions, either because it's hostile physically or because somebody is like trying to defeat us. It's a combat situation, or at least uncertain. And munitions means just what it says. So we'll go through some of these. I'll talk about the Arctic. You know, how does climate impact those missions? How does it impact readiness? What are the new missions? What are the impacts to our bases? Some of these geostrategic threats down at the bottom, we can talk just a little bit about those. The disaster relief, probably in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about this evening, but if anybody has questions, I'm happy to. So really in the Arctic, this is about security, access, and our sovereignty. It turns out, I don't know, had anybody either operated or been up in the Arctic? I know Coast Guard commander has, so a few have. You know, is there a ton of stuff up there? No, there's nothing. There ain't nothing up there. It is austere. I mean, it puts the A in austere. I mean, there is nothing up there. So you can kind of see, and I told the Chief of Naval Operations, imagine, sir, if you had to patrol the entire United States, kind of see that top center there, and all you had was a small base at San Clemente Island, which is this little tiny island off of San Diego. And that's the only base you have. And it's like, oh, that wouldn't be fun. It's like, exactly. That's the kind of ranges and distances that you have to be prepared to support yourself. Even though the ice is melting out, the operating environment is still really hard. And in some ways, it's even harder because without that ice, you have the wind can blow across the water. You actually can get bigger waves now. And if you get the bigger waves, you get icing. And I think I was quoted in some paper today as saying, you know how the United States Navy, our high-tech US Navy, removes ice from our ships? With a bosun made and a mallet. Yeah. So, you know, we're still kind of there. You know, we haven't really put much effort and technology into changing that. How are the shipping routes going to change? I'll talk about that in a second. How do the Russians think about this? The Russians have had that ice on their northern flank, their northern frontier, really since they have been a country. And if anyone's dealt with the Russians, I love them dearly, but they are sometimes a little paranoid as a country, right? So all of a sudden, their natural northern defense is not there anymore. It explains, in my view, in my opinion, at least some of the buildup that we've been seeing. They talk about search and rescue bases. Honestly, I don't know of too many other search and rescue bases with 150 nautical mile surface-to-air missile batteries on them. Yeah, it's a hell of a search and rescue base. But they are certainly building up their northern flank. I think it's in part because they see the natural defense is going. So it brings up a lot of interesting security things when you start seeing another country that you don't really have transparency on. What are they doing? What's their intent? A threat is as much intent as it is capability, and it's a challenge. That's a challenge for our security community, our intelligence community, to try to understand. Out of the Navy's 2014 Arctic Roadmap, here are some of the routes that we see opening up. And that green one is kind of interesting. That's like an over-the-top route. And we think as early as from like a decade from now, in the mid-2020s, we'll start seeing that route open up. Maybe only periodically for a few weeks at a time. But I'll tell you, once that green route opens up for 6 to 8 weeks reliably, people who run the container vessels are going to start paying attention. Their business model is reliability, not necessarily speed, but reliability. And if they know they could use that for a couple of months, it saves thousands of miles. They'll start using it. So the Arctic can become, I'll be kind of an old guy by then, but I think we will see it as a major shipping route. I think that's coming here. So we need to prepare for that. We have various strategic capabilities. This is not out of Star Wars Episode 2, but it's actually on an island called Svalbard. Svalbard is like almost at 80 degrees north. It's off the northeast coast of Greenland. It's part of Norway, mostly. There's something called the Treaty of Svalbard, signed in the 1920s, almost left over from World War I, that pretty much gives Svalbard to the Norwegians, except anybody who signed the treaty can also have like a presence there. So there's a town called Barentsburg. It's Russian. The Russians are there. You can have research there. We visited here a year ago. A year later, the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia showed up, didn't tell anyone. The Norwegians found out about it on TV. The guy's there. He's under sanctions because of the Ukraine, and Russia basically said, what are you going to do about it? So this is a place where the Russians kind of are pushing and testing and seeing what's going on here. It's so far north that it's very strategic for these are all satellite receiving antennas. They are, because of the geometries, this place here, Svalbard, can see every single polar orbiter, every single satellite, every 100 minutes, every single pass. We don't have any place in the United States, not even on Alaska, that can do that. So we have lots of capability up here, great connection down to the mainland, to Europe. It's a very strategic location for anything that we're doing in space, the ultimate high ground, and it's in the Arctic. Okay, let's talk about sea level rise. And we often think about Bangladesh, and we should, because there's a whole lot of people that are going to be displaced. Every 4 years, we have a big UN climate convention. In 2009, the island of Tuvalu were kind of the rock stars for a few days. And those are all important things. I mean, if you're an island nation, sea level rise can be an existential threat if you're just a low-lying atoll. If you're Bangladesh, you worry about where those millions of people are going to go. Those are big, big things. Let me talk about a couple things that the Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Defense, thinks about. This one on the left, I'll bet some people at least have been here, that's Diego Garcia. Little tiny atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean, actually owned by the Brits, British Indian Ocean Territory. But the United States has used this for really any security function that we have felt necessary for the last 30, 40 plus years. And as long as we're nice to the birds and the turtles, the Brits let us do that. But it's only about 4 or 5 feet above the sea level. So if that goes, really everything we do in the Middle East and Southwest Asia has to change. And we really haven't thought that one through too much. The top right, this just came out of Stars and Stripes, and I apologize to my Air Force colleagues, but the story is while we're building new space surveillance stations to really make sure that we understand everything that is up in space, one of them's on this little island called Kwajalein. And $1 billion, hundreds and hundreds of pages of environmental impact. Do you think they thought about sea level? Why would you think about sea level for $1 billion, right? You didn't pay me enough. So now the AP, the Associated Press, has said, you know, hey guys, what are you doing? And everybody's kind of pointing their fingers at each other. So again, this is a defense issue, and it comes down to a money issue because who's funding this? Us, we. It's our tax money. And if we have to go build that thing again a lot faster than we thought, that's money out of our pockets. And then the one on the right this is my no good deed goes unpunished picture. It's in Norfolk, we had a hurricane coming through. We knew it was going to come through. We get the ships out of there because ships actually at sea are safer than ships in port in a hurricane. Those are the sailors' cars. They parked them at Pier 12. Unfortunately, nobody told them that the storm surge was going to come. So when they came back in 3 days later, they were not very happy. So that's sort of a tactical issue there. You know, even in Norway, where they don't really think of sea level, I was there for another conference in Bergen, Norway, on their coast. You know, this was just a normal day. So everybody is going to deal with the sea level rise issue. We are going to deal with it. It's going to be a domestic issue. These are, I think you can see the outline of the US. This is not elevation. This is number of people within about 3.5 feet of high tide. So you see all that red down in South Florida. That's a lot of people. You can see around New York City, Norfolk, Sacramento. Around Sacramento, you have a lot of people. What's going to happen is we really haven't paid a whole ton of attention. And when we do, sort of all these towns are going to figure it out at the same time. And the states are all going to figure out they don't have money, and everybody's going to go to the federal government. About the same time the Department of Defense figures out their coastal installations are at risk. So if you think money is tight now, 2016 will rapidly be seen as the good old days, because this is going to be, you know, even in Traverse City, we're all going to pay for this. One way or the other, we're going to pay for this issue here. Okay, I'm going to talk about just one example of these geostrategic risks, and some of you may have heard the story about Syria, and of course the tragic rise of ISIS. I hope you can kind of see the timeline down here, but really, and I'll bet some people have had to do this, if you've ever had to do like an aircraft accident or a mishap investigation or a ship or something, often nowadays, you know, there's rarely just one simple cause, but it's this chain of events that happens, and this happened to this happened to this, and then you get a tragic ending, whether it's an aircraft goes down or something. And that's kind of what happened in Syria. You can even trace it back like 40 plus years ago. When Assad comes in, one of his goals was to be self-sufficient. You know, now, you know, you'd sort of want to be his advisor. It's like, dude, do you know you're like kind of living in a desert here? You know, but he's Assad, and probably if you say that, your career in the Syrian civil service is not going to be one of upward mobility. So probably it's like, boss, you are smart, handsome, and wonderful. That is a great idea, sir. We'll get right on it. And they did. And they achieved it. But they achieved it at the cost of draining their aquifers and draining their rivers. So it's like, you know, the kid out of college who wants a Ferrari, and somehow they scrape up enough money with everything and every loan. They got the Ferrari, but when it breaks, they're in trouble. So when this broke, it was in trouble. And they had some things that have nothing to do with climate that pressurize us. The Iraq War, 1 million refugees go into Syria. 1 million refugees. and they're in the cities. And it's Assad. It's not like he takes care of people very well. And then fast forward another 4 or 5 years, and now you get a drought that the science community can show with pretty high confidence certainly was worse because of the man-made global warming. But you have no backup. You have no aquifers. You have no rivers. You now just have dust where you used to grow your crops. So now you have 750,000 of what we call internally displaced people, fancy name for the farmers now move into the city, and now you just have this tinderbox of millions of desperate people, and but for the grace of God, it could have been you or me if we had been living in Syria. Think about that. We could have been us. And you're just trying to get some food, get some water, trying to take care of your family, and somebody comes up, it's like, I'll take care of you guys if you join my group. You're desperate. Who knows what we would do if any of us were in that position. But that is how these extremist groups can gain a foothold, and boom, you're off to the races. And that's kind of what happens. So I'm sorry that takes a little bit of time, but the climate was a link. It was one of the links in the chain. It wasn't the cause, but it was nothing to do with it either. So it is one of the links in that chain that got us to this catastrophic and tragic set of events that we're seeing in the Middle East right now. Okay, so some of the things of what to do. Just very simply, at least for the Department of Defense, but I would argue maybe for other organizations too, it takes leadership. And that's why I have my old boss up there, the Chief of Naval Operations, Gary Roughead. Because if Admiral Roughead, if he had not said, hey, we need to look at this, I sure wouldn't be standing in front of you tonight. We have a saying, at least in the Navy, if the boss is interested, you're fascinated. It doesn't really work in academia, I can tell you that. But it does work in hierarchical organizations. So he was interested, so we got fascinated. And he basically gave me, it was like the best set of orders I ever got, whether I was an O1 or an admiral. He basically said, Titley, I want the Navy to be seen as showing leadership at the national and international level on this issue, period. And then he left the room. That was a pretty good set of orders. So Secretary Mabus, he has done a lot with energy. And again, there's a whole story on that, and I can talk through that. When I ran the Task Force on Climate Change, people would say, oh, you're an admiral, you're in the Navy, you must have millions of people working on this. It's like, yeah, right. I had a lieutenant and a very junior civil service. They were great people, but I had 2 people. But what we had was over 400 people in 125 organizations who wanted to work with us, not for me, but with us. And building teamworks, having leadership goes a long, long ways on these issues here. There are various frameworks that this administration has done. I know these are kind of boring things, but presidential memorandums. It's like, guys, we're serious, and this is what I want you to do in the executive branch. The National Intelligence Council on the left, if you type that into Google, you can read this report. It is unclassified. It's not like, Julian Assange put it there or something. It is an unclassified report, and you can read what the National Intelligence Council says about climate and security. So again, these are not weather people. These are not Greenpeace. These are not, where's my citizen climate lobby people? Okay, this is not CCL. This is the intelligence community says, guys, this is a risk, and the risk is growing. And that's, and I think this is all useful on how you ultimately move the government. There's a number of solutions all the ways from teamwork. There's new technology in the right. I was telling a few people we have a new program in the Department of Defense that I was able to start and get through the Congress that looks at sort of near-term weather. And I call near-term out to 30 years. It's like, yeah, that's weather. So as long as I call it weather, I can get money for it. And that's what I did. And there's risk analysis, and we actually know how to do it. We're pretty good at that in the Department of Defense. We do it in many, many other places. We do it in nuclear weapons, in weapons proliferation, some very, very high impact, low probability things. We know how to manage risk. We do that. What can one person do? I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with a llama, and if you're interested, you can ask me in Q&A. I'm going to tempt you on that one. Here's kind of the crux. There's a lot of things we need to do to adapt to the changing climate, but if we want to stop the climate from changing, ultimately, we're going to need to figure out some different energy sources. And it turns out that the United States, this is just for the US, We have already gone through about 3 energy transitions in our country's life. We started on wood, and then we were mostly coal, then we're mostly fossil fuels, oil and gas. So we'll probably get to some sort of renewables or non-carbon. The question is how fast and at what rate? Do we do that faster than normal technology, slower? How's that going to happen? And that's going to have a big impact on the climate. Again, I'm happy to talk about energy a little bit more in Q&A, but in the interest of time, we'll keep going. We'll keep going. Okay, just a few final thoughts. There is some good news. I think this is actually really important good news, is if you go around this slide, sort of like a clock almost, you know, I could start at 12 o'clock, you know, fine, maybe people don't resonate with some retired admiral, retired general talking security stuff. It's like, I don't care about that. But maybe you do care about the moral arguments. Well, everyone from the Pope to very conservative Christians, Muslims, Jewish faith, Buddhists, they are all interested in this. And they talk about this not from a security perspective, but from a moral perspective. The insurance companies are worried about this because it's their business. If they get the risk wrong, they go out of business. The divestments that, you know, started at Harvard. The president of Harvard tried to tell basically the students, please go away, you're bothering me. To the students' tremendous credit, they did not, and that's spreading. Health is an issue, security. The media, James Balog's Chasing Ice, Years of Living Dangerously, there are many films. And yes, there's my one polar bear on an ice floe, because that's what we think about. The environmentalists have, of course, talked about this for a long time, and then you go up to like the 10 o'clock, the risky business. So Hank Paulson, Bloomberg, former Secretary of the Treasury, Goldman Sachs, you know, big business says, guys, this is a risk to our business. So different sectors of society, and I think this is ultimately going to be how we get forward progress, is enough people in the United States need to care enough so that the Congress can have a conversation without half of their members feeling like they're going to get fired in the next primary. So some of you probably have heard of a guy named Bob Inglis, Representative Bob Inglis from South Carolina. Super, super conservative guy. He can quote the Bible with the best of them. He was ranking member on House Science, and he basically said in 2010, you know, there might be something to this. He didn't say, let's go tax carbon at $100 a ton. He said, there might be something here we might want to pay attention to. He got fired. He got fired in the primary. And everybody else looks around at that and says, I'm not going to be the next Bob Inglis. So we, the voters, the citizens, have to make sure that our elected representatives understand it's okay, and we would like you to have a policy debate about this. We are not going to fire you for that. In fact, we encourage it. Because right now, there's a bunch of people who think they're going to get fired if they talk about this. And that's just kind of where they are. Yes, there's 10% who probably really do think it's a hoax, and I'm sorry, I will pray for them tonight. I can't help them. But there's a bunch of people who they understand it, Republicans, who really totally understand it. But they also understand the politics. And their assessment is it's a very risky, personally, move for them. And nobody that I've met wants to intentionally do something that gets them fired. Okay, there are going to be surprises all the way from climate intervention, aerosols, changes in the Arctic may lead to still yet unknown changes in the weather down here in the middle latitudes. My friend Niels Bohr on the lower right there, he famously said that predictions are tough, especially about the future. And I do not claim to have any magic crystal ball, so I'll guarantee you there will still be some surprises to come. But that doesn't mean that we're going to just like totally overturn climate science. We've not seen any evidence of that. But how fast, how much risk, those are all still in play. You know, and the thing is sort of, I know this is a little geeky graph here, but that one on the lower right, the issue is not that, well, we've kind of got, you know, this risk that we pretty much know, and it might be a little worse, it might be a little better. The risk is on the right-hand side of what we call a fat tail, and that's going to be the issue that we've got to deal with there. So, you know, I go back to, since I'm the Navy, I apologize, but I'm the Navy, I go back to what Admiral Nimitz talked about. Now, he was talking about this in reference to his good friend and colleague, Admiral Halsey, running a carrier battle group through a typhoon in December 1944. We lost 3 ships, killed over 700 sailors. It was the worst loss for the US Navy since Pearl Harbor, and it was weather-related. But Admiral Nimitz talks about taking precautions and how there is nothing worse than grudgingly taking precautions because maybe it won't happen. And I would say we have a lot of evidence that things are changing. And if we don't take precautions, we need to think about what Admiral Nimitz said, or we can think about what Secretary Shultz said as how Reagan thought about the ozone hole. And he basically said, hey, I don't know for sure 100% that these science guys are right, but what if they are right? We better take an insurance policy. So that's what he did. That's exactly what he did. So, okay, so we've been talking all this 50,000 high-level geostrategery and stuff like that. Let me just make it a little bit more personal. So I mentioned I was running the Navy's Weather and Ocean Command, and it happens to be at a place in Mississippi, Stennis Space Center, right on the Mississippi-Louisiana border, right on the coast. So I lived in a little town called Waveland, Mississippi, and that was a house that my wife and I lived in. And if you ever wonder what a 9-meter storm surge does, that's what it is. So that's me, first time coming back and figuring this out. So when we say we lost our house, we quite literally lost our house. To this day, we don't know where it is or where it went. Because it's not like I cleaned up the yard and then took the picture. There was nothing there. So it either went to the right and up into the railway tracks where half of Waveland ended up, or it got sucked back out into the ocean. The one good thing is the ugliest house on the block, you can kind of see those cinder blocks on the right. So my fantasy is my house came off its moorings there, knocked down the ugly house, and that was okay for me. I can live with that. But, you know, so I show this not to have sympathy. We were the luckiest people on the coast. We had flood insurance. So many people did not. My stuff wasn't even in there because I was in the process of getting moved back. I had a moving truck going there. Now, you haven't lived until you try to tell a Navy moving truck that you can't go there anymore. It's like, but that's on the orders. It's like, no, really, you can't go there. And it's like, but that's what it's like, please listen. So we were really lucky. But think of the millions of people when they lose that. They have nothing. They have absolutely nothing. They don't have a bank account. They don't have insurance. They have basically a hole in the ground. And, you know, if you don't take care of them, either before, during, and afterwards, and it's not just in the US, but worldwide, you can have real security issues, not to mention the moral and ethical issues as well. But just from a security perspective, you can have large security issues. So I like to end with this gentleman here. Turns out Winston Churchill never actually really said anything because all the historians say, no, he didn't say that. But one of the things he was alleged to have said is that Americans can always be counted upon to do the right thing after exhausting every other possibility. So I would say that pretty much describes where we are in climate. We will eventually get to the right thing, but I'm not sure exactly when. So, General, I'm not sure if the Air Force has this saying, but I know the naval aviators do, that, you know, 2 things are of no use to you when you're flying a plane, and that is one is altitude above you, and the other is runway behind you. So as I think about this, we're kind of putting a lot of runway behind us right now on this issue because the more and more we keep sort of on business as usual, that means the more and more we are going to change the climate. And if you change it enough, it's not like the Earth is going to stop. The Earth will be fine. But those ecosystems and those ecosystems that we use to support those 8 billion people of us, because this is a people issue, that's going to be the $64 question. How do we do it? So sooner is better. Yesterday would have been better. Today is good. So I talked about beliefs. So here's my belief. My belief is that America is still, in fact, the indispensable country. It is still the country that the rest of the world, and I know this, looks to leadership. Because I get to travel the world in this job, which is super cool. But when you talk to people, you realize, and even countries that we may not think of as our allies, they look to America for the example. They look to America for leadership. If we do nothing, they don't feel like there's a tremendous reason to do something. If we take this seriously, lots of others will as well. So, you know, of course, this comes out of the Tom Hanks movie, and, you know, the more you read the real history of Apollo 13, you realize that by all rights, those astronauts should have been dead. I mean, they should still be in space and they should be dead. We did not let that happen. You know, we did amazing things in an amazingly short time. Now, I know climate is a different scale, but our country, when we get motivated and focused, still can do and does incredible things. And that's what I would like to think is going to happen, but it's really going to take all of us ensuring that our elected leaders understand that it's not only safe, but it's needed and it's necessary to have those debates and set the strategy and get going with this. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Titley. We got a little bit of time for some questions and answers before we get going, and while we get the mics out and getting ready to go, Dave, I think I'll open with one. Since we both share a background in the Department of Defense, would you comment on how the Department of Defense is looking at climate change with specifically respect to how to protect our national security?
I think there's, thanks, General. I mean, there is increasingly amounts of documentation and directives. So basically at the highest levels of the Department of Defense, the Secretary, at the number 2, the Deputy Secretary, they have actually, just even in the last year, signed out a number of very good documents that say, okay, if you're on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this is what you should be thinking about. If you're a component, fancy word for saying Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, this is what you should be thinking about. If you're on my staff, the Secretary of Defense is, and doing policy, think about this and do this. If you're the people that buy aircraft and tanks and ships, this is how you need to think about climate. The $64 question is, we've got all that written. I'm not sure, Brian, if it's totally sunk into the bureaucracy. And I don't use bureaucracy in a pejorative sense, it's just what it is. So 20,000 plus people in the Pentagon, millions of people when you add up civilians and soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And, you know, when I look at it, again, not to pick on the Air Force, because the Navy does equally stupid stuff. We're building an oceanography building at the U.S. Naval Academy that we didn't really think about sea level rise. It's like, duh. So I mean, that headline could be Navy just as easy as Air Force, and both the General and I know it could easily be the Army, right? Oh, yeah, that goes without saying, right? So all services do this. So, you know, we have all this great documentation and DOD directives and da-da-da, but are we doing it? And I would say we still have a long ways to go on that.
Questions from the audience?
Sir, could you explain the llama?
The llama, okay, I know. I always get asked about the llama. Sure, let me go back. I'll go back to my llama slide here, Brian. Let me just back it up. Llamas, one each. There we go. Okay, so we all know how you go viral on the internet, right? Cute cats. I have no cute cats, so I have to have a cute llama instead. So really, what I use for the llama is just a little acronym. The first L is learn. And when I say learn, it does not mean become Michael Mann. It means there's a document that is available on the internet from the American Association of Advancement for Science, but you don't have to type all that. You can type AAAS, 3 A's and an S, AAAS. What we know. That's all it is. It's a perfect title because it's really easy to remember. What we know. It's about 8 pages. It is written so that I will guarantee you every single person in this room and the students, if there are any students left, watching, everybody will get it. It's written in beautifully clear, simple, just easy to understand English. And that just kind of explains through the basics of climate change that you would want to know as a citizen. And again, if you want to be a climate scientist, sure, come talk to me and I'll get you into Penn State or something. But, you know, if you want to, just as a citizen, it's perfect. Then if you really want extra credit because you're just one of those overachiever people, we all know who you are, type in National Academy of Science, or NAS, Royal Society. That's the Brits version of the National Academy of Science, although they would say they formed theirs first, but whatever. And type climate change, but with those two. And there's about a 30-page document that then takes you from the 90th percent level to the 99th percent level, but it's written by the National Academy of Science. It doesn't have a cute, catchy title I can remember. And it's not quite as clearly written. I mean, it's written more for science-y types. It's really good, but it's not quite as accessible as the What We Know version. That's the first L. Second L is local action. And what I mean by that is do what you can, you know, but you all know your individual lifestyles. I'll bet we got some folks here live on a farm or do some farming, I'll bet. Yeah. So, you know, you need to run your farms. I mean, you gotta run your farm. You're probably not gonna run your farm on a Prius, I'm guessing. I could be wrong, but I'm guessing you're not gonna do that. You know, I'll bet we got people here who like to boat, like to do stuff with RVs, yeah? I mean, I do. You know, so there are gonna be things you can do, but in general, think about, as you get a chance, as we all do in life, to make future decisions about like where we're gonna live or what we're gonna do, think about your food, your energy, your water. In very rough, gross terms, everyone in the US, I'm not like picking out people, but everyone in the US, all of us, we waste about a third of our food, a third of our energy, a third of our water. So just sort of think about, hey, what could I do to kind of cut that down, but not living in a cave, wearing a hair shirt, and saying, I'm the martyr and you guys all need to be with me. Just a short example. So 3 years ago, I moved from Washington, D.C. up to Penn State. For our budget, we sort of had two choices. I could have lived 5 to 10 miles away, and I could have had a big new house out in the country, probably an acre, a couple acres, whatever. Or I could live really close to campus, older house, somewhat smaller house, but I could walk to work. And that, to me, was really appealing. So for the same amount of money, now when I'm on campus, I have like 0 carbon footprint on my commute because I walk. What I like even more is the university doesn't get any more parking ticket money out of me because I can't tell you how much they got out of me when I was an undergrad. And then, of course, you know, you don't even get a transcript until you pay. It's like, haven't I paid you guys enough? But not that I'm bitter or anything. And, you know, but I had that choice. So and then over time, as we've lived there, like we put in double pane windows, we put in insulation, what a concept. And, you know, and we've really been able to reduce our heating bill for just sort of simple type stuff. So that's, you know, but different people are going to be able to do different things. But I got a 4-wheel drive car. Why? Because I live in northern Pennsylvania and I need to get to Washington. And I'm not going to do that in a car that doesn't have 4-wheel drive. So I'm not, believe me, I'm not holding myself up as I'm this 0 carbon guy. But when I have a choice, it's one of the things that I try to think about. M, very simple. If you're on the technical side, and I give, you know, a bunch of talks to like science people at NASA and Department of Energy, the whole way we monitor the climate, all that stuff that I showed you from NOAA and NASA, honestly, it's baling wire and chewing gum that holds our system together. You would think we're a rich country and we could like have a decent climate monitoring system. It's sort of at the bottom of the feeding trough of priorities. So stuff's always breaking. There's always these dangers of like data gaps. We're always hoping the Europeans will have a space mission because we screwed ours up. And, you know, that's not really a good way to run a railroad. Monitoring can also be, though, monitor what your local politicians say. Just see what they're actually saying. That's another monitoring. And then finally, the A is advocacy. And this is, and I kind of talked about this. I mean, my question, whenever I get a chance in front of an elected leader, is just ask him or her or him, what, ma'am or sir, are you doing to stabilize our climate? So it's kind of an open-ended question. And with all due respect to my Citizens Climate Lobby friends, I don't ask, are you supporting a revenue-neutral carbon tax? And the reason I don't is that's a yes or no answer. It's like, no. Okay, now what am I going to say? You know, it's sort of like dating 101. Don't ask yes and no questions. Ask open-ended questions. So get them to think. I mean, because really what I want is I want to have an actual, no kidding, I know this is fantasy in today's world, but I would like to have an actual, no kidding, policy discussion. It's like, what planet do you live on, right? But that's what we need. And whether that's, I personally think a carbon tax is a good idea. I'm on the Citizen excuse me, Climate Lobby Board of Advisors. But there may be other options, and politics is the art of compromise, and you don't always get everything you want. But you got to have that discussion, and you can't have some people saying, well, this is what we're going to do, and other people saying, yeah, we don't even have a problem. That's not a discussion. So, and even if you get a lousy answer from your politician, in that reptilian stem cell politician brain, it registers that one of their bosses was interested. That's probably worth every bit as much as whatever answer that you get. Because right now the perception and the reality is nobody cares. And if nobody cares, why am I going to go and put myself out there for something that nobody cares about? Congress will not lead, but they can be led. And it's our job to lead them. Okay,
Right
next.
here.
Who is next?
Well, number one, thank you very much for coming to Traverse City.
Okay.
And number two, I think a lot of people in this community follow your llama type of perspective in not only dealing with government, but also in their private lives. But I have a more specific question. A lot of the models are suggesting that with climate change, you'll see rising levels of seawater. Are the models projecting that it is all due to melting of ice, or are there other sources that are going to cause the levels of water to rise?
Okay, it's a really good question. I think everybody heard. I'll try not to get too science techno-geeky here on people, but for these small amounts, when we're talking inches, there's a number of factors that are involved. It turns out, this isn't really surprising, if something gets warmer, it expands, exactly. We all remember that from middle school science. It expands. Water's no different. So warm water takes up more space than cold water. And that's actually where a fair amount right now of the sea level rises come from. It's, fancy, science, we got to have a fancy term. We call it thermal expansion. Warm water gets bigger, takes up more space. There are local effects, such as changes in the currents, like the big currents, like the Gulf Stream. Turns out that, when you stir your coffee, this is not a perfect analogy, but when you stir your coffee, it's like it's really low at the center, right? And it comes up at the edge. Well, the Gulf Stream is this really big current, and it's sort of low on the coast with the cold water, and it gets high with the warm water. So actually, when I drove my ship from Norfolk to the Mediterranean, I actually went up about 3 feet. Now, it wasn't like all at once and you got to lift the ship. It's not like that. You don't really notice it. Okay, you don't notice it at all. But when you use the satellites, it's actually about 3 feet higher. There is some evidence that the Gulf Stream's slowing down. So, let's say the water along the coast was that level. The rest of the Atlantic is here. What do you think happens when it slows down? So you get some relative sea level rise that doesn't have anything to do with warming or melting ice. But this is not helping Norfolk. Norfolk, this is part of their issue. Something that really doesn't have either much or nothing to do with climate is what's the land doing? Some places the land is going up and down. Norfolk, again, you're getting some subsidence. It's actually left over from the Ice Age. New Orleans is going down. That's not so much the Ice Age. It's a combination of we've so dammed and channeled the Mississippi that all that silt doesn't go and build things up, and all the natural gas and oil extraction, things are sinking from there. If you melt enough of the ice, you actually start changing gravity fields, and that changes distribution too. So there's a whole bunch of things that happen, and these things are basically in the inches category, but really the $64 question is what happens to the ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland? Because then we're going to stop talking about inches or maybe a foot, and then we're going to talk about feet and tens of feet. And nobody's going to care about whether it's 10 foot 3 inches or 10 foot 6 inches. It's going to be 10 feet of sea level. So that's not coming right now, but that's what we're baking in over long term, over a period of a few hundred years. 2 degrees Celsius is equal at least about 15 feet, 15 feet of sea level. 4 degrees, which would be business as usual for the rest of this century, that's probably 30 plus feet of sea level rise. So go look at a map and sell your South Florida properties now. Because, yeah, they're going to be in trouble. So I hope that helps. So right now, sort of for our lifetimes, there are these secondary factors. But the big story is going to be ultimately Greenland and Antarctica. Thanks.
Admiral Titley, thank you. We'll take one more question here in the back, right back in here, right up in there.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
You mentioned earlier Congress can be led. Mm-hmm. I heard that there was an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill recently passed by the House of Representatives that actually prevented Defense Department from mitigation and other studies related to climate change, forbidding the Pentagon from heeding your warnings and adapting and changing as necessary to their climate. I was wondering, I think it's stymied at the Senate. Not
That's
sure.
Correct.
Wondering what your feeling about that is. I'm pretty sure I'll know. But also what we citizens can do to squash that.
Well, it's a great question. And there's, for anybody who's worked in Washington or worked with the legislative process, it turns out there's actually a lot of places where you can influence legislation if you sort of understand the process and know where it is. So you're exactly right, sir. There is what they call a rider, a piece of, a statement, if you will, I believe it's in the authorization bill that the House of Representatives has passed that does prohibit the Pentagon from at least looking at basically climate-related things. So the chances of that getting through the Senate are extremely small. They've tried this before in the House, and the Senate kills this. And it's not that the Senate has a huge amount of climate supporters, but there are enough people, especially on the Armed Services Committees, who kind of say, hey, if you talk about these changes, and when I talk to especially the right of center senators, I talk about it as these are the changes. It kind of show those early animations. And say, sir, Senator, Congressman, we don't even have to talk about why it's changing. But unless somebody can tell me that change is going to stop, then we kind of need to keep preparing for that. So, okay, yeah, I get that. And so there are ways to talk to the Senate to have a very, very high chance that that language will not survive any what they would call conference. The administration can, when they choose to engage with the Congress, say, guys, this thing here, this has got to go. This is, you don't want to veto. We don't want to veto. We don't want to even use a threat, but please make this go away. So the administration has opportunities to weigh into this. But right now, it's kind of a cheap thing for the House to put in, or some members of the House. Maybe they have big fossil fuel interest. Maybe they have other interest. And again, there's nothing really pushing against that because the perspective is, on a list of top 20 things that Americans count on, this is like number 23. So, it's not a risky vote for them to put stuff like that in there. So that's what I mean, that they're not leading, but we can help them ultimately out of that. What can you do? Very simply, especially if you have a member of Congress that is supporting that, you can ask her or him, ma'am, sir, this is not helpful. You can really go to that National Intelligence Council report, unclassified. You can just post in the link. I think for these reasons that our intelligence community has stated, we need to at least be able to think about this problem. Thank you for your attention. Boom. So that's what I would write to them.
Dave, on behalf of the audience and also our membership and our patron members, thank you for taking your time to come out and enlighten us here in Traverse City. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks so much, Brian. Thanks.